Hello, and welcome to another edition of the One Drink Book Club. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. Say Nothing is the true story of a murder that happened in Northern Ireland in 1972. But the book is about more than just a single murder. It gives a detailed and gritty look at the IRA and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And tonight, my guest is Peter Blumberg, a friend who always enjoys a good book and definitely enjoys a good cocktail. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You made the suggestion for this book, and it's um, super interesting. I really enjoy nonfiction, and I didn't know really. I mean, I knew about issues in Northern England or Northern Ireland and knew about the Troubles, but I really had no kind of in-depth knowledge. Did you know about it, or was this book a real a first look for you?
For me, I've always enjoyed history books, and I've read a lot of history books about the world wars, the American Revolutionary War, and the American Civil War. So, in part, I was interested in the book just to kind of spread it around and learn about something else. And I would also say that this story, in my opinion, is a bit underreported, you could say, because
Sure.
of what we might talk about later about the code of silence that was sort of imposed upon on the people involved. And so not that much was really said about it, in my opinion, and that's why I decided to pick it up. I suppose one other factor that makes me interested in the book is that my personal ethnic background is Latvian, which is a small country in Eastern Europe on the Baltic Sea. And the Latvians have always been oppressed by others, including, well, the Russians, the Soviets, and but also the Germans and the Swedes. And so, there was a little bit of a connection maybe for me with the plight of the Irish and the Catholics in Northern Ireland.
Of anybody I know, I think you've spent more time in Europe and are more immersed in European politics than anybody else I know. And so it actually kind of surprises me that you were coming at this um, kind of from the same perspective, that you didn't know a whole lot about it. But your point about the fact that the code of silence, the whole book's name is Say Nothing, um, kind of lends itself to that, which makes sense. And it was a civil war, and if nobody is talking about it, it kind of makes sense that we don't know a whole lot.
Yeah, I think it's that. Although, I imagine I know that your target demographic for this podcast is 20 somethings, but let's say people who grew up in the that grew up
I
in the
don't know
seven.
if that's true.
I know I was joking, but the people who grew up in the 70s, I mean, we remember some of these things. I still very well
Yeah.
remember when Lord Mountbatten's boat was blown up, and he was the cousin of the Queen Elizabeth, and he was supposedly Prince Charles's favorite uncle, and it was just crazy that things were happening like this. And similarly, you referenced that it was basically a civil war, and this brother upon brother fighting just seemed so foreign to me, and I think to us as Americans. I mean, we of course had our own American Civil War, but that was a century and a half ago. And although I have to say, we've now it does sort of feel like we're a bit of a divided country again, and so hopefully we can resolve our differences and not resort to anything
Yeah.
bigger than just debating.
Agreed. Um, well, you also, as I said, you're probably one of my friends who has been to Europe or spends more time in Europe than anyone else I know, but you also are probably the premier cocktail maker that I know. So,
Besides
what,
yourself.
but
Yeah.
besides myself,
Mhm.
so I'm curious what you made for tonight.
Yeah, well, I just took a sip of my drink, so that must have been the cue for you to ask this question. But yeah, the drink I paired with this book is inspired by a Belfast bar located actually, though, in New York City. And the bar is called the Dead Rabbit. And it was founded a couple of years ago by two Belfast Irishmen. They're actually Irish Catholics. I had double checked on that. And it's become one of the most famous bars in the United States. It's won multiple awards. It in the name, the Dead Rabbit, the name of the bar, is named in honor of one of the original gangs of New York that
Oh,
have been
cool.
portrayed in movies. And the bar is actually located in Lower Manhattan, not far from the heart of Wall Street, in the area that used to be called the Four Points, where the gangs of New York used to rule. And so the particular drink that I made tonight, it has been on their menu for many years. I had it just last summer when I was visiting there, and the drink is called Doctor's Orders. I'm not really sure what that exactly means, but I would loosely compare it to a whiskey sour in that it has about half of it is just spirit, Irish whiskey and bourbon, and then the other half is citrus. So it has lime juice and grapefruit juice and simple syrup. The But it's an elevated cocktail because it has other elements. The simple syrup is actually I infused it with cinnamon, and then also I use this allspice liqueur as well. That's all part of the recipe, and so it's a kind of a cinnamony fall like whiskey sour, I would say.
Ooh, that sounds really good, and I am impressed that you have an allspice liqueur. I have never heard of an allspice liqueur.
Yeah, I forget the brand, but you can buy it at in liquor stores. Yeah.
Interesting. So, clearly the Irish car bomb was like a, pretty obvious choice for this book, but I decided that that would be almost too obvious. So, I did a little research, and there is a drink, that's very much based on a Negroni called a Belfast Bastard.
Mhm.
So that's what I made tonight, or actually I ordered. I am, in a hotel room in Boca Raton right now, and it has, 2 ounces of gin, a half ounce of dry vermouth, a half ounce of Campari, so that's like your basic, Negroni, but the difference is that it has a little bit of pamplemousse liqueur inside with a couple of dashes of orange bitters, so that's what makes it a little different, and I really like to say the word pamplemousse, because I think that's a fun French word.
Sounds great. Yes, I love a good Negroni, and yeah, it's such a straightforward drink in that it's a one third one. It's you just need three ingredients and kind of evenly dispersed. But because of that simple canvas, you can kind of upgrade it with interesting things like pamplemousse. So yeah, sounds
Yeah.
good.
So in the book, Say Nothing, it starts out with the murder or disappearance of Jean McConville. And the author uses this, kidnapping slash murder to kind of give you a storyline, and people to look at, but it really is about a lot more about that. And it kind of starts in 1968, it goes through the mid-70s, and then it picks up again and it reintroduces some of these characters in more recent years. Um, but did you find kind of the story arc of the Jean McConville, um, disappearance a good way to kind of look at the issue of the Troubles overall?
Yeah, not only would I say it was an effective uh, device, I would dare say that it's probably the book's claim to fame because it sort of takes a traditional history book model, in this case, a book trying to teach us about the Troubles, but uses elements of a mystery whodunit as well as maybe a true crime genre book to propel the story along. And you know, I had read the book initially about 4 years ago or 3 years ago, whenever it came out, and, reread it in preparation for tonight, and I had forgotten that there was, at the end of the book, kind of a surprise reveal about who done it, what happened to Jean McConville and who was the trigger person. So that makes it, you learn a lot about the Troubles, about something maybe a lot of us never really knew about, but you have a very intriguing storyline. And also, you had talked about that. I mean, this Jean McConville woman's story was a real tragedy because she was a mother of 10 children. She was a widow. She lived in basically tenement housing, and as you said, was kidnapped basically in, I think, in broad daylight, um, in front of her neighbors, and no one did anything about it. And it's just really sad.
Well, and I think I the fact that you're right, that that happened in broad daylight, everyone knew what happened. Everyone saw it. No one said anything, goes to what you were mentioning with this code of silence. But it was interesting to me to see all the players in this conflict. You had the Protestant paramilitary people. You had the Irish paramilitary people in the IRA, but then the IRA was split between the more aggressive IRA, the Provos, and the Stickies, who were like the more traditional IRA. And then on top of that, you had Britain sending in the army, which was supposed to be a neutral peace force, but they were clearly more siding with the folks who were the Protestants. And so it was crazy to me. At one point, they were talking about one character, and he was attacked, and he wasn't sure who was attacking him. He didn't know if it was the British. He didn't know he was a Provo IRA, but he didn't know if it was the regular IRA who was after him or if it was the paramilitaries on the Protestant side. I mean, talk about not feeling safe. I mean, here you had a a society of 300,000 people in Belfast, and absolutely no one felt safe. That was crazy to
Yeah.
me.
I mean, I don't think you mentioned also the Belfast police. There
Mm.
was just the local police that were also primarily Protestants and oppressing the Catholics. So, and then also just the people themselves, because one of the things about Jean McConville was that, and this is possibly why she had such a tragic life, unfortunately, she was a Protestant who married a Catholic. So she was living, when they first got married, they were in a Protestant neighborhood. And because her husband was Catholic, they were sort of literally like bullied out of the area by their neighbors who didn't like the fact that a Catholic was living in their area. And then they moved to a Catholic area. And, that may have contributed to how she became disappeared, because people didn't care for a Protestant living in their neighborhood. So just a big, very unfortunate.
Well, and I think to your point, it feels so foreign to, an American audience that you would have these religious, um, divisions so heavily, in there that where you literally have barricades in front of Catholic neighborhoods and Protestant neighborhoods, and you have almost like your own police force, and they literally built walls in between these neighborhoods to keep these people from killing each other. I mean, it's crazy to me.
Yeah, and it wasn't always, the one thing that the book explores this a little bit, and there's a lot of more history on it, but it wasn't necessarily a religious war either, because what was underpinning a lot of it was that Northern Ireland, as I think most of anyone who's listening to this probably knows, that Northern Ireland is technically part of the UK, that it's not part of Ireland, but, um, there were the Catholics wanted to unite Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the rest of Ireland, into one country, and there were others who liked being part of the UK and just thought that that gave advantages to the country to be associated, to be part of the kingdom with Wales and Scotland, and they just sort of saw some kind of kinship there. So, a lot of moving parts to the conflict, really.
Well, the author, mentions at one point that because of this bizarre situation that both the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland felt like minorities, because the Catholics in Northern Ireland were the minority numbers wise. They were half of the population, or they had half the number of people that the Protestants did. But the Protestants were so concerned that if Northern Ireland became part of Ireland, that those Protestants living in Northern Ireland would then become the super minority because most of Ireland was Catholic. And so here you had a unique situation where both groups felt like threatened as minorities,
Yeah, no,
which
good point. Yeah.
very unique situation. So I thought it was interesting as you started reading about this, and the author kind of spins this tale, he goes into a lot of the characters and a lot of the people who were key uh, combatants in the IRA. And as you started to listen to them and you heard about the Protestant abuses and the British abuses, it was easy to kinda get sucked into this kind of romantic Robin Hood impression of the IRA. I thought, um, these people were oppressed, they were fighting back. There were clearly some incidents where they were wronged, and you thought to yourself, "Well, yeah, they're justified in kinda taking up arms and fighting back." But then as you got more into the book, I felt like, geez, they're really off the rails. There's not a lot of, morality here, and at the end of the story, I wasn't quite sure who was a good guy and who was a bad guy. Did you have where did you fall at the end of the book after you've kinda seen it all?
Yeah. Well, it definitely was it's a complex situation and, yeah, I suppose most people would land in the middle. But if forced to pick a side, so um I I suppose maybe this is why in the introduction I tried to point out my own ethnic background. But coming from people who have been oppressed, I suppose I identified with the resistance to a degree, and in this case, that would be the Catholics who were being oppressed by the British troops and the Belfast police. And I think another thing that is, an element here that we have not touched on is that at this time there was still this basically centuries old caste system in play where Belfast Catholics were not eligible or could not get elected to public office. They were not given government jobs. They really even couldn't get a proper education. They were just kind of shunted towards working class jobs or really even pressured to emigrate. That a lot of Northern Irish Catholics left for places like the United States because they just didn't feel welcome in the country. So, it was not really a fair system. You had mentioned, Jamie, that I've traveled in Europe quite a bit, and I was in Dublin a couple of years ago and touring the city. And in the heart of Dublin is Trinity University, which has a lovely campus and has Gothic architecture and big church spires. And I was talking to my hosts and saying, "Oh, so this is like the Harvard of Ireland. This is where all your best and brightest go." And they're like, "Well, no, I mean, for centuries, it was only for the British. The Irish could not
Wow.
go there. Only, occupier British sent their kids there, and the Irish were not welcome." And that just seemed like a crazy thing to me. Imagine, I mean, you and I both live in the DC area. Imagine if Georgetown University, which also sort of towers a little bit, you could say, over the Potomac, and we can see its beautiful spires and buildings. Imagine if Americans couldn't attend Georgetown, that it was only for the Brits who are here. That would be a crazy thing, but that's how, so I guess to answer your question, I lean Catholics here, even though I myself am not Catholic. I'm Lutheran. Um,
Well, the one thing that struck me, beyond the paramilitary violence was how egregious the British troops were in terms of kind of lawlessness. I mean, this is not like 1930s or 1920s or the 1800s. This is in 1970s, and they had an entire division or a entire subgroup of the British Army that was in Northern Ireland that was assassinating people. I mean, that is I mean, talk about not following the rule of law. Um, it really was interesting to me, both from a arresting people, torturing, people, and interrogating them, but also just flat out assassinating people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, a lot of terrible things. The chief constable or whoever was in charge of the British Army, he actually had we have to remember that this was still kind of the remnants of colonial England. So a lot of these people had been in Britain's African colonies and in other, places that you might call the third world, and they had developed these brutal techniques to dealing with their colonists in those places, and they deployed a lot of those techniques onto Irish. So because it's, their playbook, I guess you could say. But I didn't want to cut you off, but I do want to say though, nevertheless, I mean, it's for sure as you said at the start, the Catholics were also responsible for a lot of things, including, the murder of the central character, Jean McConville, who, you know, I, I think, and hopefully this isn't a spoiler, but it seems like at the end there, it certainly seems like they may have made a mistake in thinking that I think they thought she was a police informant, and now it looks like she probably wasn't. And and she was the whole like this whole business about the disappearing people. It was used as a noun. Part of it was that, in the book anyway, that they actually felt shame. They knew that what they were doing was not really right, so they would just bury people in peat bogs along the Irish coast where they would never be found again, and then they could, like, tell their supporters, like, "Oh, maybe the person just emigrated to America," that's where they went.
Right.
So, I think that, and we also see that some of the l lead characters in the book, feel, that at the end of their lives, they seem to feel a lot of shame about what they did, the murders that they committed, I think, uh, sat on their conscience pretty heavily, at the end there.
Well, and it seemed like the murders that they felt kind of the worst about were the murders of their own kind of part of their own club, because they had a really brutal justice system. If somebody snitched, or if, somebody kinda broke the rules, they were even more violent and more brutal with their own members, and I think those are the ones that they probably felt the worst about, in
Yeah, man.
retrospect.
Yeah, well, the book describes situations where a person who was thought to be a snitch was brought to a safe house where he was held for a few days, and then the people who were holding the prisoner, you know, became began to like the person and just couldn't pull the trigger. They had to bring in basically like anonymous hit squads to murder the snitches because these people were. I mean, it just shows again that this was a brother on brother war, and it's hard to imagine that they would do this to each other. But
Well, and brother on brother kind of reminds me of this kind of family connection. One of the central characters in this book, is Dolores Price and her sister, Marion, and their parents, they grew up from a very young age listening to stories about their father's involvement in the IRA and the bombs that he set, and the different, missions he ran, and so there was this real connection, kind of through the generations of, this is what we do as Irish Catholics trying to win our independence, and it was a super strong force, and, um, Dolores Price was this kind of interesting character, and she was this young woman who was, cute and vivacious, um, but then extremely violent and extremely loyal to the IRA cause. and they follow a lot of the things that she did, and, um, she really, was an effective guerrilla warrior, and it was interesting. I mean, it was kind of this combination of the free love feminism of the '60s and '70s combined with the violence of the Troubles.
Yeah, Dolores Price, very interesting historical figure, and that's again where this book sometimes seems to be right on the line between fiction and nonfiction, because this is like the sort of character that if you were a great novelist, you would want to invent, Dolores Price. Yeah, my take on her is that I guess referencing for the third and last time my Latvian background, I am familiar with families where there has been this generational tradition of descent, and that and I say, well, thank goodness there are people and families like that, or that there were in Latvia and other parts of Eastern Europe to fight against the communists. And so Dolores Price reminded me a little bit of some of these people that I know from my Latvian experience. Another interesting part about some of the stories that we hear about her in the book is that she was bit of a feminist groundbreaker, and she broke some glass ceilings at the IRA. The book describes a story about when she first showed up to work there, and the leadership offered her secretarial work, or said that she could serve like coffee and biscuits to the men at the IRA planning meetings, and she said, "No way, I'm going to be sitting at the table at these meetings." And and then that's where she ended up being. And and then, I, the other thing, probably the central, to me, the most interesting chapter of the book was the so-called Old Bailey bombings, when the IRA decided to take the fight from Belfast to London, to sort of, because it was thought that the British were just, like you said, just sending their troops there and indiscriminately shooting the Irish, and not really. And so, of course, this is like a form of terrorism, but or is terrorism. But she was a central figure in in some car bombings that took place in London. But my one takeaway from that whole uh, event, which led to her becoming world famous, I would say, was like because she was caught and then tried. But they she had, according to the book, had gone out of her way to try to ensure that there wouldn't be casualties, that the bombs would be more symbolic, that there were warnings to clear people out of the way. And in fact, no one, one person died of a heart attack related to the bombings, these particular bombings. And so, I guess one thing you could say about Dolores Price is that maybe some of the violence that she perpetrated was intended to be more symbolic than, murderous.
You know, that's an interesting take because I really struggled with that idea because Dolores Price and her sister understood the power of the media, and they knew that their own image as women was going to be viewed differently than, kind of a male terrorist. And I think it's very tough for anyone to claim, "I'm gonna put 200 pounds of explosives in a car and put it in a central London location, and that I'm not trying to kill anybody." I think that, there's just that's not realistic. It's not a sane, logical answer, and I get, and you don't set it for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If you wanna do it at 3 in the morning, then maybe that's the case. I mean, I think that they were taking a calculated risk. They probably didn't wanna kill more people than they had to, but I don't know that they were, it was a symbolic bombing. I don't know how you do a symbolic bombing in downtown London at 3 o'clock and claim that you weren't trying to hurt anybody. Um, the part I thought was interesting that stuck with me because I, like you, read it probably when the book first came out, and then I reread it to do this podcast. And the part that I was like, "Oh, yes, I remember this part," was when, Dolores and her sister, who were involved in this bombing, were tried and they were sent to prison, and they felt it was unfair for them to be sent to prison in Britain. They wanted to be held in Northern Ireland, and the way that they protested that decision was to go on a hunger strike, and it really put the British authorities into a quandary because if these 2 women died on their watch, they would become martyrs, and they also didn't wanna give in and then create a situation where lots of people were doing hunger strikes to get any number of, different things that they wanted. And so the British responded by force feeding the women, and it sounded like a terrible, awful system where they basically pried their mouth open and they put a feeding tube down their throat once a day and fed them food that had been kind of blended up. And eventually the women won after about a year of doing this. But they were next to death's door when they were doing these hunger strikes. And it was a weird situation where you felt sympathy for them because they were so committed. But at the same time, I mean, these 2 women were in jail for bombing kind of civilians, and so, I think that was kind of the crux of the whole thing, where you had people there was nobody who was clearly a white hat or clearly a black hat in this book.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, I think that we find out in the book that in later years, Dolores Price, um, it seems like she became an alcoholic, divorced her husband, and, I think that the weight of some of her actions must have, weighed on her and caused her to feel remorse. She died, I would say, relatively young as well, uh, but yeah. On the hunger strike, yeah, one thing that I found interesting about the book was that these hunger strikes were addressed or were problems at the highest level of British government. The prime minister at the time, Roy Jenkins, and then later Margaret Thatcher, was involved in. Thatcher was involved a little later. They had moved the sisters to a northern. One of their goals was they wanted to be held in Northern Ireland, in a jail in Northern Ireland. They didn't, want to be released necessarily from jail, but they wanted to be jailed in their home country. But yeah, another thing that their point too was that they were um, basically they were combatants in a war, and that's why they felt like they should be repatriated to their if they're going to be held as prisoners, they should be repatriated to their country where they came from, not uh, in a British jail. But yeah, um, it was certainly you could question her acts, no doubt about it.
Um, so have you ever been to Belfast? That was one of my questions for you.
Yeah. I have, like I said, I was in Ireland a couple of years ago. I was in Dublin and then I visited a few other cities. But I never made it to Belfast. And actually, Ireland isn't that big. You can travel from the west coast to the east coast in, like, I don't know, a couple of hours. And so to drive up to Belfast from Dublin is also not a very long haul. So I definitely want to visit it. Um, Ireland in general is a very picturesque country, and the people are just wonderful. They are sort of like fit the stereotype that we hear about them. In my opinion, they are talkers, raconteurs. They like to, you know, uh, socialize, and so I really enjoyed my time with the Irish, and I've also heard that Belfast is rapidly changing for a variety of reasons. As you and your listeners might know, Ireland has become a very wealthy country in recent years, in part
Mhm.
because of how they're gaming the international tax system by kind of allowing itself to serve as a tax haven for major corporations, including a lot of pharmaceutical companies and so on, but and tech companies. But because of this, they're very wealthy, and of course, Northern Ireland is not part of that, but it's also, I understand, flourishing. Not they're not part of the Irish Renaissance in that they're literally a different country,
Right.
but they also, I've understood that Belfast is very much modernizing and an interesting city, so I'd like to visit it.
Yeah, I would too, although, it there was parts of the book, it was not exactly a tourist brochure for, Belfast. It definitely even, and towards the end of the book, they talk about a few incidences that were, 10, 15 years ago. It's not all in the 1970s. I mean, they still have some issues going on. Um, but, it definitely they painted a grim picture of life in Belfast, at least in the '70s and probably early '80s. So I would love to see that Belfast is more progressive, it's safer, and, that the people have a chance. Because the thing that struck me that was about how many residents of Belfast were not part of either side. I mean, they were kind of regular folks who would spend weeks huddled in their houses, afraid of bombings or stray bullets or any other kind of violence. And so, I mean, it's like a whole city has post traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, that's a really interesting, sad thing to see.
Well, all right, Jamie. Now you've convinced me that I have to give it a few more years before I visit there. But uh, yeah, no, the book is definitely not. The tourism bureau is not necessarily putting out posters about from this book. Um, but yeah, no, I agree with your assessment. Though one of the interesting characters in the book, who's mentioned a couple of times, is Dolores Price's husband, the famous actor Stephen Rea, who
Yeah.
is himself. He is Protestant, even though Price is a famous Catholic, and
Right.
but the one reason that their marriage worked was that Rhea was one of these people that you sort of alluded to, that he wasn't that into it. He wasn't
Yeah.
like into this Irish versus Catholic battle. And so he just lived his life and tried to keep his head down when the shrapnel was falling. And that's I think that there were, millions of Northern Irish that fit into this category that just wanted to go about their business. So,
Um, well, before we wrap this up, one person we haven't talked about at all is Jerry Adams. And if you were to ask me before I read this book, name anybody you can associated with the IRA, I think Jerry Adams would be the person I would mention. And, it was interesting to me to learn more about his story and about his personality and about his history. Um, where did you what did you think of Jerry Adams after reading this book?
yeah, he is I agree that a lot of people friends who I've talked to about this book have said that they think that Adams has been portrayed, that they changed their views on Adams because it seems as if he was involved in a lot of murders, and he's sort of been had denied it. Um, and I think that his issue is simply that he was kind of rolling with the times and hoping to just kind of move on. Honestly, the way that certain politicians are doing now, it's like, well, that they're just doing the expedient choice. So when he was moving up the ranks of the IRA, he needed to authorize murders and do authorize bombings. And then when he wanted to become a politician, he had to act like he didn't know anything about it. and really, he probably just should never have gone into political life given his background, but he did, and, yeah, so at the same time, he was responsible for, I guess, the ultimate peace accords, the Good Friday Agreement, and a lot of, some of the, I guess, his staunchest defenders would say this information about the negative information about Jerry Adams that's in this book about his involvement in murders comes from people that are mad at him for brokering this peace agreement, um, that he betrayed their cause because their cause was to fight to the death, fight for a union with Ireland or nothing. And this peace agreement, it actually gives the Northern Irish Catholics, a pathway to a Irish reunification. And so that, in that respect, is a win for the Catholics. Um, but yeah, the people who wanted to achieve their goals through violence, and war, were disappointed in Adams's diplomacy, and maybe they were tarring his reputation out of anger and without actual facts. I mean, I guess Adams would also say, he had been investigated, and they could not develop any proof to prosecute him for any of these crimes. It was just hearsay, 30-year-old hearsay. So, um,
Yeah, I mean, I admired him for his savviness, and I think his pragmatism, and when he thought that violence would be a way to achieve their goals, I think he I I'm I'm pretty certain that he took part in that. But then he was also smart enough to keep his distance, or at least his hands off certain things, enough so that he could make his diplomatic play as well. And so I'm kind of torn on him. I think that he probably did do some of the things he's accused of, but I also think that you you couldn't have had somebody with the credibility that Jerry Adams had with his own side in order to be the person who was brokering a deal if he hadn't been involved in the violence. You can't have it both ways. You can't have somebody who's squeaky clean, who never agreed with the violent guys, get the violent guys to do what you want.
that's
That's
an
why
interesting Yeah, that's an interesting take, that I hadn't thought of, because part of my thinking was that it was one of those situations where thank you that they should have retired him, perhaps. Thank you, Jerry, for your service. Now that this is entering a new phase, a diplomatic phase, we're going to have new leadership. But perhaps, as you say, that new leadership would lack the credibility because it didn't, go through the experiences that
well,
led to
and
this
you
negotiation.
if you think about a lot of political leaders who were able to broker big peace deals or big changes, like in the Catholic Church, usually it was a pope or a leader who was pretty hardline, who ended up being in power and then having a change of heart or a shift in thinking. Because if somebody had been that reformer, they would have never been elected or risen to the top. And so you see that a lot where you get somebody who everybody who's the hardliners think, ah, this is our guy. And they're the person who end up being the one who can do the biggest reform because they have the credibility.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
kind of interesting.
Well, we'll see. The Good Friday Accords are still, in motion, and there are other factors. Brexit is a major factor, and the impact of, and like I said, Ireland's newfound wealth has made, I think, a lot of Northern Irish, caused them to think, maybe we should join in with these rich people. Yeah, it's still, an ongoing process, but, now it feels like more like the rest of the world, not just this oddball, place where they're fighting medieval style in modern
Right,
times.
right. So what are you reading these days? What's on your nightstand, Peter?
Well, I just started a new book called Playworld by Adam Ross, and it's a novel, but this is how I'll describe it. It's kind of trendy. Um, I had picked up on it because this guy, oh, I forget his first name now. His last name is McNally. He owns Balthazar Restaurant in New York City, and he's kind of just a tastemaker in New York. And he recently recommended it, and I follow him on Instagram, so I kind of checked that and ended up buying the book. And I'll compare it to the book is very similar to something like John Irving, and I love, it's like a modern day John Irving because it's kind of a quirky story. The protagonist is young. There's a lot of like just weird, out of the blue sexual situations that Irving, was famous for always doing. So it's a good book. So I like to mix it up between fiction and nonfiction. So right now I'm doing fiction. I had recently also
Nice.
read a couple of Civil War books. So now I'm back on the fiction train.
I usually do those where they're, if especially, sometimes even good nonfiction can feel like you're studying a textbook sometimes, and so the page turner novel is always a nice palate cleanser.
Yeah. I was thinking that so this author that we're talking about today, Patrick Radden Keefe, this is like lightish history though, because
Sure.
Keefe himself is a New Yorker magazine writer, and so he knows how to tell an interesting story and keep the reader engaged. And those types of authors, one of the books I recently read was by Eric Larson,
Oh,
who
yeah.
and he has his newest book is about the attack on Fort Sumter, which then kind of led to the start of the Civil War. But so, there's 400 pages about that era, basically the months leading up to Fort Sumter. And but good
Eric
information.
Larson. Yeah, and Eric Larson does a great job of telling those stories, those nonfiction stories, almost like a novel, and that book is, that's been on my nightstand for a little while as well. It's definitely in the queue to read, so I'm excited to do that.
Yeah, these authors, I mean, I, I suppose that if you're a hardcore Civil War, history professor at some fancy school, you might look down on this book by Larson. But I mean, he has it well footnoted, and I think it's all generally accurate. But he does, what he does, just like Keefe. He has certain takes. Like he does, like kind of suggest this guy was a bad guy, this was guy was a good guy, and
Sure.
you know, the truth of the matter is probably somewhere in the middle. But in order to write a compelling book, you might have to create some, heroes and villains, I suppose.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time, to do this podcast with me. I enjoyed the book, again, and, it was fun to talk about.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thanks for your tough questions, forcing me to think on my feet here.
Well, I look forward to the next time
Challenging my
your cocktail abilities.
yeah.
Well, I
Yeah,
look
we'll
forward to the next time to drink
yeah.
in person together.
Yeah, no, I'll next time I see you, I'll try to mix this. Have the ingredients ready to mix it for you. It is actually a very good drink, so
It sounds
yeah.
good.